I am Elena Morrison, 29 years old, and yesterday my world turned completely upside down. My grandmother Isabella left me everything. $3.2 million, her sprawling Mediterranean estate, and controlling shares in her luxury jewelry empire. I was still reeling from the shock when they appeared at my doorstep. My parents, Marcus and Diana Morrison, the same ones who vanished from my life 16 years ago without so much as a goodbye note. They smiled as if no time had passed at all. "Darling, we're here to help you manage this overwhelming responsibility," my mother announced with practiced sweetness. Then my grandmother's attorney, Mr. Richardson, stepped into the room, and their confident expressions crumbled into panic. Before I dive deeper into this incredible journey, let me share where this story begins. Hit that like button if you've ever had to deal with family members who only show up when there's something to gain, and subscribe to hear more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. My childhood was a picture-perfect illusion until everything shattered when I turned 13. We lived in an elegant brownstone in Manhattan's Upper East Side, surrounded by the kind of luxury most people only dream of. Dad was a successful investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and Mom was a prominent socialite who organized charity galas for New York's elite. We weren't just wealthy, we were part of that exclusive circle where money was never discussed because it was simply assumed to exist in abundance. Saturday mornings meant breakfast at the plaza, followed by shopping at Bergdorf Goodman, where Mom would let me pick out anything I wanted. Summer vacations were spent in the Hamptons at our beach house, where I learned to sail and play tennis with private instructors. Christmas meant trips to Switzerland, where we'd stay at five-star resorts and I'd receive gifts worth more than most families' annual income. To the outside world, we were the perfect family living the American dream. But behind our mahogany doors and crystal chandeliers, cracks were beginning to show. The hushed arguments that echoed through our marble hallways grew more frequent and more vicious. Dad's late nights at the office became routine, and when he did come home, he reeked of expensive whiskey and unfamiliar perfume. Mom's charity work became an obsession, a way to maintain appearances while avoiding the reality of our disintegrating family. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came when I was 12. I had returned home early from school due to a sudden migraine, expecting to find our usual peaceful afternoon routine. Instead, I discovered three men in dark suits sitting in our living room with my father, their voices low but their body language aggressive. They noticed me immediately, their conversation stopping abruptly as they assessed this unexpected witness. "Daddy?" I called out uncertainly, sensing the tension in the room like electricity in the air before a storm. "Elena, sweetheart," Dad said, his voice artificially bright. "These are some business associates. Why don't you go upstairs and rest? I'll have Mrs. Patterson bring you some tea." But I caught glimpses of their conversation as I climbed the stairs, words like deadline and consequences and family spoken in tones that made my stomach clench with anxiety. One of the men had scars on his knuckles, and another kept checking his watch with impatient precision. These weren't the polished Goldman Sachs executives I was used to seeing at Dad's business dinners. Over the following months, these mysterious visits became more frequent. Our longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, began making excuses to stay late, hovering protectively near me whenever these strangers were in our home. She never said anything directly, but her worried glances and the way she double-checked all our locks at night told me everything I needed to know about her concerns. My father had always enjoyed high-stakes poker games with his Wall Street colleagues. What started as friendly competition among millionaires gradually escalated into something much darker. I overheard heated phone conversations about margins and positions that sounded nothing like the banking terminology I'd grown accustomed to hearing. Men in expensive suits began showing up at our door at odd hours, and Dad would disappear into his study for intense conversations that left him pale and shaking. The change in our household dynamics became impossible to ignore. Our chef was let go without explanation, replaced by takeout orders that arrived at irregular hours. The weekly flower deliveries stopped coming. Several pieces of Mom's jewelry disappeared from her collection, though she claimed to have loaned them to friends for special occasions. When I asked about these changes, both parents would brush off my concerns with vague explanations about temporary adjustments and streamlining expenses. During this period, I began noticing other troubling signs. Bills would arrive by certified mail, requiring signatures that made both parents tense and irritable. Phone calls would come at all hours, causing Dad to disappear into his office for hushed conversations that often ended with the sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall. Mom started having mysterious appointments with doctors whose names she wouldn't share, claiming they were for routine checkups, even though she would return home with prescription bottles she hid in her purse. The social facade became increasingly difficult to maintain. At school functions, other parents would ask pointed questions about Dad's recent absence from various Wall Street events. Mom's charity friends began commenting on her distracted behavior and sudden inability to make the large donations she had previously been known for. Several longtime family friends stopped calling, and our usual invitations to exclusive social events dwindled to nothing. I tried to compensate by being the perfect daughter, thinking somehow my achievements could restore our family's stability. I threw myself into academic excellence, winning essay contests and science fairs with desperate determination. I volunteered for every school activity, joined the debate team, and learned to play 3 musical instruments, as if my accomplishments could somehow shield us from whatever was threatening our world. The nights became the worst time. I would lie in my canopy bed, listening to the sounds of arguments that grew more intense and desperate as weeks passed. Sometimes I heard Mom crying behind their bedroom door, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. Other times I heard Dad pacing in his study until dawn, the floorboards creaking under his restless footsteps while he made phone call after phone call to people who never seemed to have good news. One particularly terrifying evening in late October, I awoke to the sound of breaking glass. Creeping to my bedroom window, I saw a black sedan parked across the street with 2 figures inside, their cigarettes glowing in the darkness. They sat there for hours, watching our house, and I was too frightened to fall back asleep. The next morning, when I mentioned the car to my parents, they exchanged a look that told me they knew exactly what I was talking about. "Sometimes people get curious about successful families," Dad explained weakly. "It's nothing to worry about, Princess." But his hands were shaking as he poured his coffee, and Mom spent the entire day with the curtains drawn, claiming she had a headache. That afternoon, a security company installed new cameras around our property and upgraded all our door locks. The workers were efficient and professional, but their presence felt more ominous than reassuring. Mom changed too, but in different ways. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the hollow look in her eyes, and her designer clothes hung looser on her increasingly thin frame. She started taking mysterious pills from unmarked bottles, claiming they were vitamins when I asked. Some days she wouldn't leave her bedroom at all, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would whisper to me that Mama needs rest when I inquired about dinner plans. I tried desperately to be the perfect daughter, thinking somehow my behavior could fix whatever was breaking our family apart. I maintained straight A's at my prestigious prep school, excelled in every extracurricular activity, and never complained about anything. When other kids at school gossiped about their parents' divorces or financial troubles, I'd defend the institution of family with fierce determination, as if my loyalty could somehow keep ours intact. The day they disappeared remains etched in my memory with devastating clarity. It was a Thursday in November, unusually warm for late fall in New York. I woke up that morning expecting our usual routine: fresh squeezed orange juice in crystal glasses, eggs Benedict prepared by our chef, and the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal folded precisely beside Dad's coffee cup. Instead, I found an empty house that felt cavernous and cold. Their bedroom door stood open, revealing closets with half-empty hangers swaying slightly in the air-conditioning breeze. Mom's jewelry box sat open on her vanity, but all her most valuable pieces were gone. Dad's study looked as if it had been hastily ransacked, with papers scattered across his usually immaculate desk and his computer hard drive missing entirely. On the kitchen counter, held down by Mom's Hermes paperweight, was a single sheet of letterhead from Dad's law firm. The message was typed, formal, and devastating in its brevity. Elena, due to unforeseen circumstances, we can no longer provide the care you deserve. Your grandmother Isabella has agreed to become your guardian. We hope you understand that this decision comes from a place of love. Marcus and Diana Morrison. Unforeseen circumstances. As if their abandonment was some kind of natural disaster rather than a choice they had made. I called both their cell phones repeatedly, but the numbers had already been disconnected. I searched through Dad's desk for emergency contacts, business cards, anything that might give me a clue about where they had gone or why they had left me behind. I had met grandmother Isabella only a handful of times throughout my childhood. She was Dad's mother, a formidable woman in her 70s who had built a jewelry empire from a single store in Brooklyn decades ago. She lived in a massive estate in Newport, Rhode Island, surrounded by gardens that required a full-time staff to maintain. According to my parents, she had never approved of their lifestyle or their marriage, considering Mom too frivolous and Dad too reckless with money. The relationship between Dad and grandmother Isabella had always been strained. She believed in earning everything through hard work and careful planning, while Dad preferred the adrenaline rush of high-risk investments and get-rich-quick schemes. During the few family gatherings we had attended at her estate, the tension between them was palpable, with conversations that felt more like business negotiations than family discussions. I spent that first night alone in our 16-room apartment, afraid to tell anyone what had happened. What if child services took me away from everything I knew? What if my parents returned and I wasn't there waiting for them? I survived on leftover takeout from the refrigerator and cried myself to sleep on the Italian leather sofa in our living room, staring up at the oil paintings that suddenly felt like they were watching me with pitying eyes. The next day, our building's concierge, Mr. Rodriguez, knocked on our door with a concerned expression. He had noticed that my parents' cars hadn't moved from the parking garage in 2 days, and he was worried about us. When I told him they were away on business, his experienced eyes saw right through my lie. He had worked in luxury buildings long enough to recognize the signs of families in crisis. Mr. Rodriguez contacted his supervisor, who contacted the building management company, who eventually contacted social services. Within hours, a kind woman named Sarah Mitchell arrived with official paperwork and gentle questions that I couldn't answer. She made phone calls from our kitchen while I sat in stunned silence, watching her navigate a system I didn't understand. "I've located your grandmother," she told me after what felt like hours of conversations. "Isabella Morrison has confirmed that your parents contacted her several days ago about guardianship arrangements. She's driving down from Newport tonight to collect you." Grandmother Isabella arrived at our apartment building in a vintage Rolls-Royce that looked like it belonged in a museum. She wore a tailored black suit with pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars, and her silver hair was styled in an elegant chignon that hadn't changed in the decades I'd known her. Her expression when she saw me wasn't one of grandmotherly warmth, but rather the determined look of someone taking on an unwanted but necessary responsibility. "Pack only what you truly need," she instructed in her crisp, no-nonsense voice. "Everything else can be shipped to Newport later or replaced entirely. We need to leave before the building management begins asking more questions." The social worker helped me fill 2 large suitcases with clothes and personal items while grandmother Isabella handled the legal paperwork with efficient precision. I packed my favorite books, photo albums from happier times, and a few pieces of jewelry that Mom had given me for birthdays and holidays. As we loaded everything into her car, I took one last look at the apartment that had been my entire world, knowing somehow that I would never see it again. The drive to Newport took nearly 4 hours through increasingly rural landscapes that felt like we were traveling to another country entirely. Grandmother Isabella spoke very little during the journey, occasionally asking if I needed food or bathroom breaks, but otherwise maintaining a silence that felt both respectful and intimidating. I stared out the window, watching Manhattan's skyscrapers give way to suburban neighborhoods, then to farmland and coastal towns I'd never seen before. Her estate, Rosecliff Manor, was even more impressive than I remembered from childhood visits. The main house was a 3-story Victorian mansion with wraparound porches and bay windows that overlooked Narragansett Bay. The grounds included formal gardens, a greenhouse, tennis court, and several smaller buildings that housed staff quarters and storage for her collection of vintage automobiles. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost overwhelming after the sterile luxury of our Manhattan apartment. The legal process of establishing guardianship was complex and emotionally draining. There were court appearances, meetings with judges, interviews with social workers, and psychological evaluations that forced me to discuss my parents' abandonment with strangers who took notes on clipboards. Throughout all of this, Grandmother Isabella remained steadfast and unflappable, hiring excellent attorneys and never once suggesting that she might reconsider taking me in, even when the process became lengthy and complicated. My parents never appeared at any of these legal proceedings. The court attempted to locate them to formalize the termination of their parental rights, but they seemed to have vanished completely, leaving no forwarding addresses or contact information. It was as if Marcus and Diana Morrison had simply ceased to exist, erased from official records as thoroughly as they had erased themselves from my life. Living with Grandmother Isabella was like attending an intensive course in sophisticated living. Her rules were numerous and strictly enforced, but they came from a place of wanting me to develop character and discipline rather than mere compliance. Breakfast was served at 7 sharp in the formal dining room, with real silver and china that required proper handling. No cell phones at meals, no slouching in chairs, and conversation was expected to include current events, literature, or substantive topics rather than teenage gossip. My education became her primary focus. The local public school was deemed inadequate, so she enrolled me at St. Catherine's Academy, an exclusive boarding school for young women that emphasized academic excellence and leadership development. The transition was brutal initially, as I struggled to catch up with classmates who had been preparing for this level of rigor their entire lives. The curriculum was demanding, the social hierarchy was complex, and I felt like an outsider trying to navigate a world where everyone else seemed to know unspoken rules. But Grandmother Isabella wouldn't accept failure or surrender. "Your parents gave you advantages and then abandoned their responsibility to help you use them," she told me during one of our evening discussions in her library. "I won't make the same mistake. You have intelligence and potential, but they mean nothing without discipline and perseverance." She hired tutors for subjects where I struggled, arranged for additional language instruction in French and Italian, and insisted that I participate in extracurricular activities that would develop leadership skills. Piano lessons, horseback riding, debate club, and volunteer work at local charities filled every spare moment of my schedule. At first, I resented the rigid structure, but gradually I began to appreciate how it was building my confidence and capabilities. College preparation began during my sophomore year, with standardized test prep courses, campus visits, and meetings with admissions counselors. Grandmother Isabella pushed for Ivy League schools, believing that my future success would depend on the connections and opportunities that only elite institutions could provide. Our biggest argument came when I expressed interest in studying art history rather than business or law. "Art history is a lovely hobby for wealthy women with no ambitions," she said sharply. "But you're going to inherit a business empire that employs hundreds of people and supports dozens of families. You need skills that will help you manage that responsibility effectively." I accused her of trying to control my life and force me into a role I hadn't chosen. She countered that my parents had already made choices that limited my options, and she was trying to give me the tools to succeed despite their failures. The discussion became heated, with both of us saying things we later regretted. That night, she did something unprecedented. She knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk. For the first time since I'd come to live with her, she shared personal details about her own life and the struggles she had faced building her business from nothing. "I was 17 when I married your grandfather," she told me quietly. "I had dreams of studying literature at Vassar, but my father thought college was unnecessary for girls who would become wives and mothers. Your grandfather died when your father was only 10, leaving me with massive debts and a failing jewelry store. I had to learn business by trial and error, making mistakes that nearly cost us everything." She explained how she had built Morrison Jewelers into an international luxury brand through decades of 16-hour days, careful planning, and ruthless decision-making. "I don't want to deny you choices," she said. "I want to make sure you have enough knowledge to make good ones." This conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. I began to understand that her rigid expectations came from experience rather than mere control, and she began to see that my resistance came from a desire for autonomy rather than simple rebellion. We developed a compromise. I would double major in business and art history, combining practical skills with my personal interests. I was accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship that grandmother Isabella had secretly arranged through her alumni connections. The transition to college brought new challenges and freedoms that both excited and terrified me. For the first time in years, I was making independent decisions about my schedule, my friends, and my future. The academic rigor was intense, but I had been well prepared by both St. Catherine's and grandmother Isabella's demanding standards. During summers, I interned at Morrison Jewelers corporate headquarters, learning every aspect of the business from inventory management to international shipping regulations. Grandmother Isabella introduced me to suppliers, retailers, and industry leaders, gradually transitioning responsibilities to me as I proved myself capable of handling complex decisions. Our relationship evolved during my college years, becoming less formal and more genuinely affectionate. Our weekly phone calls included laughter and personal stories rather than just academic updates and business discussions. When I graduated summa cum laude with both my intended degrees, the pride in her eyes was unmistakable, though she limited her public display of emotion to a firm handshake and a single nod of approval. I moved back to Newport after graduation, taking a position as Vice President of Creative Development at Morrison Jewelers. We developed a comfortable routine of shared breakfasts, evening discussions about business strategy, and weekend activities that ranged from sailing to attending cultural events in Boston and New York. I dated occasionally, though grandmother Isabella had strong opinions about the character and ambitions of any young men I brought to family dinners. Then, 18 months ago, everything changed again. Grandmother Isabella was diagnosed with lung cancer, despite never having smoked a day in her life. The prognosis was aggressive but not hopeless, and she approached her treatment with the same methodical determination she applied to everything else in her life. "Death is simply another business transaction," she told me when I broke down after receiving the diagnosis. "The only variables are timing and how we choose to spend our remaining capital." She continued working as long as her strength allowed, gradually transferring more responsibilities to me while maintaining oversight of major decisions. Our roles began to reverse, with me becoming the one who ensured she took her medications, attended medical appointments, and maintained proper nutrition. During her final months, a surprising tenderness emerged in our relationship. One evening, as I helped her prepare for bed, she gripped my hand with unexpected strength. "You've become the granddaughter I always hoped for but never dared to expect," she whispered. "Taking you in was the greatest joy of my later life, even though I was terrible at showing it." She died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in early spring, surrounded by the roses she had loved tending in her greenhouse. The funeral was attended by hundreds of business associates, employees, and community leaders whose lives she had touched through her work and philanthropy. I stood at her graveside, realizing that she had become my true parent in every way that mattered, teaching me not just how to run a business but how to live with integrity and purpose. The grief was overwhelming and persistent. The massive house felt hollow without her presence, and I found myself listening for her footsteps on the marble floors or saving articles I thought might interest her. But I continued operating the business as she had taught me, honoring her legacy through action rather than sentiment. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. Harold Richardson, grandmother Isabella's attorney for over 40 years, sent formal invitations to what he called all interested parties. I assumed this meant key employees, charitable organizations she had supported, and perhaps some distant relatives I had never met. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning at his downtown Providence office. Richardson was a distinguished gentleman in his 80s, with a full head of white hair and the kind of old-world courtesy that had become rare in modern business. His office smelled of leather-bound books and expensive cigars, with dark wood paneling and Persian rugs that spoke of decades of handling significant wealth and complex family dynamics. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a navy blue suit that Grandmother Isabella would have approved of, carrying the leather portfolio she had given me when I joined the company. Richardson greeted me warmly, expressing condolences while mentioning that we were expecting several other people before beginning the formal reading. The door opened and I looked up expecting to see Morrison Jewelers executives or representatives from the charities Grandmother Isabella had supported. Instead, I found myself staring at two people I had convinced myself I might never see again, my parents. Time seemed to freeze as Marcus and Diana Morrison entered the room. My father had aged dramatically in the 16 years since I'd last seen him. His once thick dark hair was now completely gray and receding, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of stress and disappointment. He had gained considerable weight, and his expensive suit couldn't quite hide the softness that had replaced his formerly athletic build. My mother looked even more dramatically altered. Her blonde hair was now a harsh platinum color cut in a severe bob that didn't flatter her angular face. She had lost significant weight, making her cheekbones sharp and her eyes appear sunken. The designer clothes she wore were fashionable but ill-fitting, as if she were trying to recapture a style that no longer suited her changed appearance. "Elena," my father said, his voice rougher and deeper than I remembered. "Look at you, all grown up and beautiful." They moved toward me with outstretched arms, as if expecting the warm reunion they had forfeited through their abandonment. I stood on unsteady legs, my body refusing to cooperate with either fight or flight responses. My mother reached me first, attempting an embrace that I couldn't return, standing stiffly as her unfamiliar perfume triggered a flood of conflicting memories. "We've missed you so much, darling," she said, stepping back to examine me with eyes that seemed to be calculating rather than loving. "You look just like your grandmother did at your age. So sophisticated and successful. How did you know about today?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. My father attempted a sad smile that looked rehearsed. "We saw Isabella's obituary in the Times. We've been keeping track of the family from a distance, you understand. We knew you were with her and doing well." Of course. Of course they had known where I was all these years, monitoring my life just enough to ease their consciences while never actually attempting real contact. The room began to feel smaller and warmer than it should have. "Please, everyone take a seat," Richardson interjected smoothly, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged in front of his massive mahogany desk. "We have one more person joining us before we can begin." Mrs. Chen, Grandmother Isabella's longtime housekeeper and the woman who had essentially helped raise me during my teenage years, entered the room with quiet dignity. She had worked for our family for over 30 years and had been more of a maternal presence in my daily life than my biological mother had ever managed to be. She nodded at me sympathetically before taking a seat as far from my parents as the room's configuration allowed. As we waited for Richardson to begin, my parents attempted awkward small talk that felt surreal and inappropriate. "We live in Arizona now," my mother offered with forced cheerfulness. "Scottsdale. The climate is wonderful for Marcus's arthritis, and there are so many opportunities there." "I manage a luxury car dealership," my father added, straightening his tie with the gesture I remembered from childhood. "High-end vehicles, very exclusive clientele. Nothing like the old Wall Street days, but it provides a comfortable living." I nodded mechanically, unable to formulate appropriate responses while my mind raced through the implications of their presence. Inside, emotions churned violently, anger at their abandonment, confusion about their motives for returning, hurt at their casual attitude about 16 years of absence, and a treacherous flicker of the childhood hope I thought I had buried long ago. Richardson cleared his throat and opened a thick leather folder, adjusting his reading glasses with practiced precision. "We are here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Isabella Catherine Morrison," he began in the formal tone reserved for such occasions. I will summarize the major provisions before providing detailed copies to the relevant beneficiaries. My parents leaned forward slightly in their chairs, an almost imperceptible movement that suddenly made their motivations crystal clear. They hadn't come for emotional reconciliation or family healing. They had come for money, drawn by the scent of wealth like predators following a trail. Richardson adjusted his glasses and began reading. To my beloved granddaughter, Elena Morrison, I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including but not limited to the property known as Rosecliff Manor and all its contents, comprising the main residence, guest houses, and 47 acres of waterfront land, my complete ownership of Morrison Jewelers International, valued at approximately $15 million, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds totaling approximately $3.2 million in liquid assets, my personal collections of jewelry, artwork, and antiques, all vehicles and recreational equipment, and my intellectual property rights and patents related to jewelry design and manufacturing processes. The room fell completely silent except for the ticking of Richardson's antique grandfather clock. I had expected to inherit something substantial, but the scope of grandmother Isabella's bequest was staggering even by the standards of wealth I had grown up with. She had been incredibly successful, but I hadn't realized just how extensive her empire had become. My father cleared his throat delicately. "Excuse me, Mr. Richardson, but is there anything else? Any provisions for other family members?" Richardson looked at him over his glasses with the expression of someone who had dealt with disappointed relatives for decades. "There are several smaller bequests to longtime employees," he said, nodding toward Mrs. Chen, "and detailed instructions for annual charitable contributions to be made from business profits. However, the vast majority of Mrs. Morrison's estate passes directly to Elena as I have outlined." My mother's smile became strained, but she maintained her composed facade. "Well, this is quite an enormous responsibility for someone so young," she said, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that felt invasive rather than supportive. Fortunately, as her parents, we're in an excellent position to help her navigate these complex financial and legal matters. Richardson raised an eyebrow but remained diplomatically silent, though I could sense his disapproval of their presumption. "Legally speaking," my father continued with the kind of forced casualness that suggested carefully planned rehearsal, "since Elena was still a minor when she came to live with Isabella, and there was never any formal termination of our parental rights, we remain her legal guardians. We would be more than happy to assist with managing these considerable assets until she gains more experience with this level of financial responsibility." The panic that shot through me was immediate and visceral. After 16 years of complete silence, they wanted to control my inheritance. I opened my mouth to object, but Richardson spoke first with the calm authority of someone who had anticipated this exact scenario. "I believe there may be some confusion about the legal relationships involved here," he said with understated precision. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow when I can have all the relevant documentation properly organized and available for review. Shall we schedule a follow-up meeting for tomorrow at 2 o'clock? My parents exchanged a quick glance that confirmed they had indeed planned this approach together. My father nodded with barely concealed eagerness. "That would be perfect. We're staying at the Ocean House in Watch Hill. Perhaps we could all have lunch together before the meeting, Elena? It would give us a chance to catch up properly after all these years." Before I could formulate a response, Richardson stood decisively. "If you'll excuse us, I need to discuss some immediate administrative matters with Elena regarding her new responsibilities as executor of the estate." My parents hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave without securing some kind of commitment or advantage. "We'll see you tomorrow then, sweetheart," my mother said, again attempting an embrace that I couldn't reciprocate. "We have so much to talk about, so many years to make up for." As they collected their coats and prepared to leave, my father handed me an expensive business card with their cell phone numbers written on the back in his familiar handwriting. "Call us any time," he said. "Day or night. We're here for you now, no matter what you need." The door closed behind them, and I immediately collapsed back into my chair, hands trembling with the aftershock of seeing them again. They can't really have any legal claim to my inheritance, can they? I asked Richardson, hearing the desperation in my own voice. The elderly attorney's expression was grim but determined. I think you should prepare yourself for a very interesting conversation tomorrow, he said carefully. Your grandmother was an extremely thorough woman who anticipated many possible complications. I need tonight to organize her contingency plans and gather all the relevant documentation. Mrs. Chen approached before leaving, squeezing my shoulder gently with the maternal affection she had always shown. Miss Isabella was the smartest woman I ever knew, she said quietly in her accented English. She would never leave you unprotected, Elena. Trust that she thought of everything. I left Richardson's office in a daze, ignoring 4 calls from my mother before I even reached my car. The childhood fantasy of my parents' return had finally materialized, but instead of joy or closure, all I felt was a deep sense of dread and the certain knowledge that the battle for my future was just beginning. That evening, despite Richardson's advice to wait until our scheduled meeting, I found myself accepting my parents' invitation to dinner. Part of me needed answers that only they could provide, while another part was drawn by the same toxic hope that had sustained me through years of their absence. We met at the Chandler, an exclusive restaurant overlooking the ocean where Grandmother Isabella had often entertained business associates. They had chosen a corner table with a view, and both were dressed impeccably as if this were a celebration rather than a confrontation 16 years in the making. My father stood to pull out my chair with exaggerated chivalry, while my mother had applied fresh makeup and arranged her hair to better resemble the woman from my childhood memories. We took the liberty of ordering champagne, Dad announced, gesturing to the bottle already chilling in an ice bucket beside our table. Dom Perignon 2008. I remember it was always your grandmother's favorite. I don't drink champagne, I replied, requesting water instead. It was a small boundary to establish, but it felt important to make clear that I was not the malleable child they had abandoned. The first 20 minutes were filled with awkward small talk that felt like a performance staged for nearby diners. They asked about my education, my role at Morrison Jewelers, my social life, and my plans for the future. I provided minimal answers while studying their faces for glimpses of the parents I had once loved unconditionally. We owe you an explanation, my mother finally said, reaching across the table toward my hand. I kept mine firmly wrapped around my water glass, refusing the physical connection she was attempting to establish. What we did was unforgivable, my father continued, his voice carrying what sounded like practiced remorse. We were in a terrible situation, facing threats that put our entire family at risk. The people I owed money to weren't interested in reasonable payment plans or family considerations. My mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, though I noticed no actual tears. I was having a complete breakdown, darling. The stress, the fear, the medication I was taking just to function each day. Some mornings I couldn't even get out of bed, let alone take care of a teenage daughter who deserved so much better. We convinced ourselves that leaving you with Isabella was the most loving thing we could do, Dad added. She had stability, security, resources we could never provide. We thought we were saving you from the chaos that was destroying our lives. You had yourselves to offer, I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. That's all I wanted. Not money or security or resources. Just my parents. They exchanged a glance that suggested they had prepared for this response. We were broken people, Elena, my mother said. Addicted, desperate, dangerous to be around. The men your father owed money to had made specific threats about you. We couldn't risk your safety for our own emotional needs. The waiter delivered our entrees, creating a brief interruption in the emotional tension. When he departed, my father shifted the conversation in a direction that felt calculated. Isabella did extraordinarily well by you, he observed, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision. Better than we could have managed even under the best circumstances. The estate she left you is quite substantial, my mother added, her tone carefully casual. The house alone must be worth several million, not to mention the business and liquid assets. It's overwhelming for anyone, especially someone your age. I've been helping run Morrison Jewelers for years, I stated firmly. I understand both the business operations and the financial responsibilities involved. Of course you do, sweetheart, Dad said soothingly. But there's a significant difference between helping manage a business and having sole responsibility for an empire worth tens of millions. The legal complexities alone can be staggering, not to mention tax implications and investment decisions. My mother leaned forward with an expression of maternal concern that looked foreign on her sharp features. Estate taxes could consume a huge portion of your inheritance without proper planning. We've learned so much about financial management the hard way over these years. We could help you avoid the mistakes we made. I watched them carefully, noting how smoothly they alternated between emotional manipulation and financial advice. The pattern was becoming transparently clear, just as it had been with the parents in grandmother Isabella's stories about other wealthy families she had known. We could be a real family again, my father offered. Work together to manage these assets responsibly while rebuilding the relationships we lost. I have connections in the investment world that could be valuable, and your mother has experience with the kind of social networks that support luxury businesses. My mother nodded enthusiastically. We've maintained our standards even through difficult times. We understand the world you're operating in now because it's the world we came from originally. What exactly are you asking for? I said bluntly, cutting through their careful presentation. They looked momentarily startled by my directness, as if they had expected me to remain the compliant child who had once tried desperately to earn their approval. We're not asking for anything, my father said unconvincingly. We just want to be part of your life again to help however we can. Though if you wanted to help your parents get back on their feet financially, that would mean everything to us, my mother added quickly. The house in Scottsdale has a substantial mortgage that's become difficult to manage. About $200,000 would completely change our situation. Plus Marcus's medical bills, she continued. His arthritis treatment requires specialists and medications that aren't fully covered by our insurance. Another $100,000 would clear all of that. I sat back in my chair, a cold clarity washing over me like ice water. So $300,000 would solve your problems. They nodded eagerly, their masks of parental concern slipping to reveal the desperation underneath. And what about my problems? I asked. The 16 years of wondering what I did wrong, the therapy bills, the nightmares, the trust issues that affected every relationship I tried to build. What's the price tag for healing those wounds? My mother's performance of tears intensified. We know money can't fix the emotional damage we caused. But we genuinely want a chance to rebuild our relationship, to be a family again. A family that begins with a cash transaction, I observed. How interesting. My father's expression hardened slightly, revealing a flash of the ruthlessness I remembered from his Wall Street days. You have to understand our position, Elena. We made terrible mistakes, yes, but Isabella was my mother. That fortune came from family money originally. My parents helped her start the jewelry business with their life savings. So you feel entitled to it? I asked for clarification. Not entitled, he backtracked quickly. But we are your parents, your only living relatives. Blood means something in situations like this. We should be included in decisions about assets that originated from our family line. I thought of grandmother Isabella, who had demonstrated through 16 years of consistent actions what real parental love looked like. Yes, I agreed. Blood means something. But actions mean more. The rest of dinner continued in this vein, swinging between emotional manipulation and increasingly specific financial requests. By dessert, they had mentioned several other debts, suggested generous salaries for consulting positions with Morrison Jewelers, and hinted at their willingness to relocate to Newport to be closer to me and the business. As we prepared to leave, my mother embraced me again, whispering in my ear, "Think about what family really means, darling. We all make mistakes, but love forgives everything." I drove back to Rosecliff Manor through the winding coastal roads, my mind churning with conflicting emotions. Their explanation contained elements of truth that I could verify from my own memories, but something about their presentation felt rehearsed and calculated. The timing of their appearance, their immediate focus on financial matters, their prepared responses to my questions, everything suggested a carefully planned approach rather than spontaneous parental longing. When I arrived home, I found a message on my answering machine from an unfamiliar voice. "Miss Morrison, this is Catherine Walsh. I worked as your parents' accountant 15 years ago, before their financial troubles became public. I saw their names mentioned in connection with Isabella Morrison's obituary and felt I should reach out. There are things about their situation you should know before making any agreements. Please call me as soon as possible." Sleep eluded me completely that night. I researched guardianship laws and estate inheritance until my eyes burned, trying to understand the legal implications of their claims. According to everything I could find online, their position seemed weak at best, but Richardson's concerned expression suggested there might be complications I wasn't aware of. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself in Grandmother Isabella's study, now officially mine, searching through her meticulously organized filing system. In a locked drawer I had never explored before, I discovered a thick folder labeled simply Morrison Family Legal Issues. Inside was a comprehensive history that explained everything I had never understood about our family dynamics. The documentation revealed that my father's gambling debts had exceeded $2 million by the time of their disappearance. The men who had visited our apartment weren't just debt collectors. They were representatives of organized crime families who had financed his increasingly desperate attempts to win back his losses. Grandmother Isabella had received multiple extortion attempts, with my parents' creditors demanding payment in exchange for our family's safety. Even more shocking was evidence that my parents had approached several other wealthy families over the years, claiming to be long-lost relatives of recently deceased patriarchs or matriarchs. They had apparently developed a pattern of identity fraud and inheritance manipulation that extended far beyond their relationship with me. Court documents showed at least 4 different cases where they had attempted to establish fraudulent claims to estates in various states. The most devastating discovery was a series of recorded phone calls between my parents and Grandmother Isabella, spanning the entire 16 years of my residence with her. The conversations documented repeated attempts to extort money using me as leverage, threats to disrupt my education and emotional stability, and their explicit acknowledgement that they had never intended to resume parental responsibilities regardless of their financial situation. Armed with this information, I arrived at Richardson's office the following day prepared for battle. My parents were already there, accompanied by a slick-looking attorney who introduced himself as James Crawford. They had obviously spent considerable money on legal representation, which raised questions about their claimed financial difficulties. "Just a precaution," my father explained with a tight smile when he saw my reaction to their lawyer's presence. "These matters can become complex, and we want to ensure everyone's interests are properly protected." Richardson greeted them professionally but without warmth, his assistant wheeling in several carts loaded with bankers' boxes and legal files. The atmosphere felt more like preparation for litigation than a family discussion about inheritance. "Before we address any claims or concerns," Richardson announced, opening the first file, "I should clarify the complete legal history surrounding Elena's guardianship and residency with Mrs. Morrison." He removed several official documents, spreading them across his desk like evidence in a courtroom. "When Elena came into Isabella's care, temporary guardianship was established through family court with your written consent," he said, looking directly at my parents. "However, social services documented multiple attempts to contact you regarding permanent arrangements, all of which went unanswered." My mother frowned convincingly. "We were dealing with serious threats to our safety, moving frequently to avoid dangerous people. We never received formal notices about any legal proceedings." "Interesting," Richardson continued, "because someone did respond to the court's inquiries on your behalf." He produced another document. "A man named Vincent Torres contacted the court 6 months after Elena's placement, presenting signed affidavits allegedly from both of you consenting to permanent guardianship transfer and waiving all future parental rights." My parents exchanged a glance that lasted just long enough to confirm my suspicions before my father spoke. We never authorized anyone to represent us legally. Those signatures must be forgeries or someone was impersonating us." Richardson adjusted his glasses, clearly prepared for this response. Mrs. Morrison had similar concerns at the time and hired a private investigation firm to verify the authenticity of these documents and locate you for direct confirmation of your intentions. He opened another file containing surveillance photographs and detailed reports. The investigators documented your activities across several states during the relevant time period. Mr. Morrison, you were photographed at various casinos in Nevada, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Mrs. Morrison, you were working under an assumed name as a cocktail server in several of the same establishments. The color began draining from my mother's face as Richardson continued relentlessly. When the investigators finally approached you directly about Elena's situation, both of you explicitly confirmed your desire to terminate all parental responsibilities permanently. These conversations were recorded with your knowledge and consent. My father's jaw tightened visibly. That was a difficult time. We may have said things we didn't mean because of the stress and fear we were experiencing. Additionally, Richardson said, ignoring the interruption and opening yet another file, the investigators documented a payment of $50,000 from Vincent Torres to your joint bank account the day after those affidavits were signed. Mr. Torres, as you may recall, was representing the same criminal organization that had been threatening your family over gambling debts. The room fell completely silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning system. Crawford, their attorney, whispered something urgently in my father's ear, but Dad waved him off with obvious irritation. Mrs. Morrison continued annual investigations to monitor your activities and evaluate whether any contact with Elena would be beneficial to her emotional development, Richardson continued. I have 15 years of reports documenting continued gambling activities, multiple arrests for fraud and identity theft, bankruptcy filings, and several incidents involving law enforcement in various states. He turned to a different section of documents. Most significantly, I have records of dozens of attempts by both of you to contact Mrs. Morrison directly, requesting money for various claimed emergencies. Medical bills that were later proven fraudulent, business opportunities that were actually pyramid schemes, and family crises that investigation showed to be entirely fabricated. My mother made a small sound of protest, but Richardson was far from finished. When Elena turned 18 and was legally an adult, you increased these requests dramatically, apparently hoping that Mrs. Morrison's affection for her granddaughter would make her more susceptible to financial manipulation. The elderly attorney reached for a sealed envelope that looked familiar. Mrs. Morrison left specific instructions for this exact scenario. He handed the envelope to me, and I recognized Grandmother Isabella's precise handwriting spelling out my name. Perhaps you would prefer to read this privately? Richardson suggested, but I shook my head and broke the wax seal, unfolding several pages covered in her distinctive script. My dearest Elena, I read aloud, my voice stronger than I had expected it to be. If you are reading this letter, it means I have passed away and your biological parents have suddenly reappeared with financial motivations. This is not coincidence or unfortunate timing. It is a pattern they have followed for the past 16 years. My mother attempted to interrupt, but I continued reading without acknowledgement. Since the day you came to live with me, Marcus and Diana have contacted me an average of once every 3 months, requesting money for various alleged emergencies. I have documented every conversation, every threat, every manipulation they have attempted using your welfare as leverage. The room was completely silent as I turned to the next page. 6 months after your arrival, they demanded $100,000 to ensure their continued cooperation with the guardianship arrangement. When I refused, they threatened to disrupt your schooling and emotional recovery by filing false claims of abuse or neglect. I paused, looking up at my parents' stricken faces before continuing. When you were 16 and beginning to flourish academically and socially, they contacted me claiming Diana had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and needed immediate treatment funding. My investigators determined this was completely fabricated. The final page contained the most damaging revelations. During your senior year of high school, they somehow obtained your email address and sent you 17 messages requesting financial assistance for a family reunion and promises to rebuild their relationship with you. I blocked these communications to protect you from their manipulation, just as I have protected you from hundreds of similar attempts over the years. My voice finally wavered as I read her conclusion. I have never told you about these incidents because I hoped you could heal without additional betrayal. I wanted you to form your own opinions about family relationships without my influence. However, I will not allow them to destroy your future the way they destroyed your childhood. I carefully refold the letter, my hands trembling with suppressed emotion. Thompson, I said, using Richardson's first name for the first time, do you have the recordings grandmother Isabella mentioned? He nodded grimly and activated a digital player on his desk. My parents' voices filled the room with crystal clarity, discussing strategies for accessing my inheritance and their plans for relocating to Newport to maintain closer supervision of Elena's financial decisions. The recording was devastating, revealing not only their mercenary motivations but also their complete lack of genuine remorse for abandoning me. They discussed me as if I were an investment rather than their daughter, calculating potential returns on their efforts to re-establish contact. Crawford, their attorney, was frantically taking notes and whispering urgent advice that my parents seemed reluctant to accept. Finally, he spoke directly to Richardson. My clients are prepared to withdraw any claims to the estate in exchange for a reasonable settlement that acknowledges their relationship to the deceased and their daughter. How much? I asked bluntly, curious to hear them price their parental abandonment. $5 million would allow us to rebuild our lives and establish a proper relationship with Elena going forward, my father said, his salesman persona returning as he sensed a potential negotiation. $5 million, I repeated slowly. For 16 years of abandonment, multiple attempts at extortion, and a pattern of criminal behavior that extends across multiple states. Richardson cleared his throat. I should mention that Mrs. Morrison included a specific provision in her will regarding any attempts to challenge the estate through legal or financial pressure. Such actions would result in the entire inheritance being transferred immediately to a charitable foundation for abandoned children, leaving nothing for anyone to claim. Crawford's pen stopped moving across his legal pad. This was apparently information he hadn't anticipated, and the implications were clearly serious enough to concern him professionally. Furthermore, Richardson continued, I have been authorized to file criminal charges for attempted extortion, fraud, and conspiracy if this matter is not resolved satisfactorily today. The threat of criminal prosecution seemed to deflate my parents' remaining bravado. My mother began crying genuine tears for the first time since their arrival, while my father stared at his hands with the expression of someone whose final gamble had failed spectacularly. What do you want from us? My mother asked, her voice small and defeated. I want you to leave, I said quietly. Today, permanently, and without any further contact. Richardson will provide you with restraining order documentation, and any violation will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. My father's face darkened with anger. You're making a mistake, Elena. We're your family, your only family. Someday you'll realize that blood is more important than money, and we won't be available to help you then. You're right about one thing, I replied, standing to signal that our meeting was over. Blood is more important than money. But grandmother Isabella was my family. You were merely biological contributors who failed to fulfill your commitments. As security officers escorted them from the building, my mother turned back one final time. This isn't who we raised you to be, she called out desperately. No, I agreed. This is who Isabella raised me to be. And I'm grateful for that every day. 6 months have passed since that confrontation, and my life has finally found a peaceful rhythm. The restraining orders have been effective, with no attempts at contact from my parents since their departure from Newport. According to Richardson's periodic reports, they returned to Arizona and have since moved to Florida, apparently continuing their pattern of targeting wealthy families with fraudulent inheritance claims. Morrison Jewelers has thrived under my complete leadership, with 3 new boutique locations opening in major cities and online sales increasing by 40%. The employees who knew and respected Grandmother Isabella have embraced my vision for expanding the business while maintaining her standards of quality and ethical practices. The most meaningful development has been the establishment of the Isabella Morrison Foundation for Family Healing, a nonprofit organization that provides counseling, legal assistance, and financial support for young people who have experienced parental abandonment or family manipulation. Through this work, I have met others with similar stories, and together we have created a community of chosen family that proves love is built through consistency rather than biology. The estate feels like home now in ways it never did during my teenage years. I have redecorated several rooms to reflect my own taste while honoring Grandmother Isabella's elegant legacy, and the gardens she loved have become my refuge for morning meditation and evening reflection. Perhaps most importantly, I have learned to trust my own judgment about relationships and intentions. The experience with my parents taught me that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and that protecting myself from manipulation isn't selfishness, it's wisdom. Standing in Grandmother Isabella's greenhouse last week, tending the roses she had loved so carefully, I realized that her greatest gift wasn't the inheritance she left me. It was teaching me that family is created through daily choices to show up, support, and love unconditionally. These are the values I carry forward, and the legacy I hope to leave for the chosen family I continue to build each day.